If you want to take your guitar tone from sounding like this to sounding like this, then I'm going to show you what to do in this video. If you've seemingly got all the right ingredients to get in a really great guitar tone, but you're still struggling to get a sound you like, it could be that you're overlooking something that a lot of people, and myself included, don't pay enough attention to. And it's now the main thing that I focus on when I'm in the studio or playing live. So in this video, I'm going to show you how much of a difference the way that we play can drastically change our guitar tone. When I was younger, I used to read a ton of guitar magazines, and you'd always see interviews with people saying things like, I played through James Hetfield's rig, borrowed his guitar and his picks, and it sounded nothing like I imagined. Then I gave the guitar back to him and it sounded completely different. And when I was younger, I just kind of thought this was a bunch of nonsense or people being pretentious. Or sometimes you'd hear guitarists say things like, it doesn't matter what rig I play through, it always just sounds like me. And again, to me as a kid, it just sounded cocky and made me cringe. But I had somewhat of a light bulb moment years later when this became really clear to me and I saw there was actually a lot of truth to this. Now, to preface, in this video, I'm specifically talking about rhythm playing. Now, obviously, bending and vibrato and all that kind of more expressive types of playing can be really distinctive and make people stand out. But for this video, just talking about riffing. So back in 2010, my band was in the studio doing our second record, Edge of the Earth, and we were tracking a song called Apparitions, and I turned to our other guitarist, Alex Bailey, and said, hey, why don't you track this riff? And after he recorded it, it sounded completely different, as in it sounded like someone had changed the settings on the amp. And this wasn't a difference in tightness, it was just noticeably different. Alex is an amazing guitarist, amazing riffer, amazing at leads, and we have a lot of similarities in the way that we play. But back then, in particular, we definitely had very different tones just from the way that we picked and palm muted. And I think in more recent years, the way that we play kind of melded together and we kind of ended up at the same place. And nowadays, I'm really focused on the way that I pick and palm mute to get the best out of each riff that I'm tracking. And after watching players like James Hetfield or Rob Flynn, the way they hold a pick, the way they dig in, the way they palm mute, I realized I was leaving a lot of options on the table, not exploring different ways of playing when I was tracking riffs. Now, I'm really confident in my ability as a guitarist, both as a rhythm player and a lead player, and I actually put way more emphasis on my rhythm playing. But I never used to pay as much attention to the way that my playing sounded, as opposed to just focusing it more on being tight and clean. So don't underestimate the different options you have when you're in the studio or playing live to make your guitar sound different. Some of those old school Bay Area thrash players like James Hetfield, Gary Holt, or Eric Peterson have an amazing right hand, and sometimes they really dig in and overemphasize that pick attack to kind of make the guitars crunch a bit more. And the way these guys developed their playing could have been partly due to the fact that the era they came up in, there weren't as many high gain options. And in the early days, if they didn't have the best gear, they'd really have to dig in for that tone. It's really important to understand you can only get a really great guitar tone if you've put the time in tracking it. You cannot rush through recording guitars and expect decent results. I would rather listen to a less than perfect guitar tone, but with really great playing, someone who's really digging in and knows how to control the amp, versus the best sounding rig, but a really bad player who's not picking hard enough or doesn't have enough control over their playing. Would you rather listen to a symphony played by amazing musicians, perfectly in tune, but with really cheap gear, or a bunch of beginners on the most expensive gear in the world? It would always be the first option. Great playing can elevate your tone or make an average guitar tone sound way more satisfying. When my guitar plugin came out, and I saw a comment from someone saying, I have this guitar with these pickups in it, and the tone I'm getting sounds completely different to the tone you're showing in this video. It was almost like they were assuming that I had a different version of the plugin that I used, and then the one that we sold was completely different. Now, this would be terrible marketing, so that is definitely not the case. But I tried to help them figure out what the problem was. So it could have been a broken cable. It could have been that they have active pickups and didn't realize that the battery needed replacing. But if not, the only other thing I could think about is just the playing. And I could only really assume that this was a beginner guitarist that didn't really have enough control over the way they played. But the point is, no matter what your ability level is as a guitarist, we could all be paying way more attention into the way that we play. So I'm going to show you a few different examples of how playing in different ways can get you a different sound. I'm going to be changing how hard I'm picking. I'm going to be changing my palm mute position. But all of this kind of thing is really best done when you experiment for yourself. This guitar currently is in E flat. It has 10 to 52s on it, and I use green Tortex picks. So if you pick lightly, you will get less high-end attack in your tone, and you'll get a woollier, kind of more muddy low end. So this would be an example of light picking. And this is an example of slightly more aggressive picking. So the difference in sound can go from and paying attention to how choked up your palm muting is can be dependent on the riff that you're tracking. If you're doing some down picking as a single note or as a chord, you can change your palm mute position to get something more choked up or a bit thicker. So sometimes players like James Hetfield, Gary Holt or Rob Flynn, they'll kind of overpronounce that pick attack and slightly scrape the string as they dig in, as opposed to. So there's no right or wrong way to do it. It just really depends on what your personal preference is and maybe what the riff calls for. So typically speaking, I pick quite hard, but when it comes to really fast thrashy riffs, that can sound a bit too thin. So if I picked as hard as I could on a fast Slayer riff, it would be like this. Whereas I like to get a bit more low end thump on my alternate picking to make it sound more like this. So again, if I just tried to pick the string as hard as I could, versus. But the best way you're really going to hear these differences is in context when you've got two guitars tracked and it's in the mix. Right, so I've just got a basic single note riff tracked. This is some light picking. And this is, I wouldn't say overly aggressive picking, but this is how I would normally pick. So I'm going to track some basic down picking in a really light way. And then we'll do some more assertive picking. So let's listen back to them. So the first thing I want you to look at is what happens to this kind of 260 area here. We're going to go from the soft picking to the hard picking. So this peak here instantly goes down when we start picking a bit harder. So this is going to actually give us a clearer tone. It's not just about having more pick attack, it's actually taking out some of the mud from the tone. And then we look between 2 to 5K, that is the bite of your guitar tone. This is the main area your guitars live in the mix. So aside from it sounding like we've got different gain settings on the amp, which we haven't touched the settings on the amp, same guitar, it's just the way we're playing, we're getting more high end coming through. It's not just about the sound of gain or aggressiveness, we're actually getting a brighter, clearer pick attack in the mix. Now, if you track a DI, you're going to be able to see what your picking looks like. To set the level for your DI, you just want to beat the hell out of the strings and make sure you're not clipping. And if the hardest picking that you do isn't clipping, then you're good to go. So that can be a difference between picking like this and this. And then the angle that your pick hits the strings can make a difference. So if you go slightly more side on with your pick and sort of rake into the strings, you get a bit more of that coming through. And again, this isn't just about how hard you pick, it can also be where your palm muting position is. So sometimes if you want it more choked up, a little bit more towards the neck, if you want it a bit thicker and a bit more sustained to the palm mutes, you go a bit more towards the bridge. So let's say you've got a generic breakdown section, you want the guitars to really swell and sound thick and heavy. The difference in where you palm mute is going to affect that. And I'm going to start by tracking it way too choked up and not how I would track it. So let's listen back to the two different versions there. The first one is the overly choked up one, and then it switches to a slightly different palm mute position to get a bit more of that swell coming through. So as I said, this is really something that you need to experiment with yourself. Everyone plays slightly differently, uses different gauge strings, pickups and picks, but exploring as many different options as you can is a great thing to do, especially when you're tracking different types of riffs, because a certain type of picking and palm muting may not be best for every single riff. But just to remind you, you don't want to pick as hard as you can. But being assertive with your picking, really digging in for the pick attack is great. Going too far is just going to make your tone a bit too scratchy and thin. So the focus of this video is to get you to try and experiment with this stuff for yourself and see how the different ways you can pick, palm mute, is going to affect the way your guitar tone sounds. So to me, I think this is one of the most underestimated and undervalued parts of getting a really great guitar tone. So definitely try and explore as many options as you can when you're recording or playing live. And if you want to get your hands on some of my mix-ready impulse responses, I'll put the link in the description. And if you're still struggling to try and emulate some of your favorite guitar tones, then check this video out next.